her just prior to introducing her, saying, I really love the title of this talk, The Other Allies. One of the things that the Missions Committee at the YWCA Princeton has been working on is something called the White Ally Toolkit. This is a toolkit that we are trying to develop to help our friends who are white to be comfortable talking about race, talking about the issues in racism. And we often need to understand that it's not just the white allies that we need to talk about race. There are others who experience race from a completely different vision, through a different lens. So, Toni-Anne, thank you for introducing us to the other allies.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. First, I want to apologize for I don't have much of my voice. I was planning to wow you all with my Jamaican accent, but it's not going to come out just right if I'm all gravelly. But thank you for coming, and I'm looking forward to a really lively and insightful conversation with you. So, the other allies. I thought that this was an important way to look at the Black immigrant, because we kind of think of Black as a group, and in our stand against racism, we need all the allies we can get, and we can't afford to miss anyone in the conversation. We have to make sure we're reaching everyone, and the messaging has to work for each group of us. So I have to admit that when I said I would do this, it was kind of like a heart before brain moment for me. It's something I think needs to be discussed and talked about, but a lot of this doesn't come with cold statistics and verifiable evidence. So I'm going to start right now by telling you I'm going to make some generalizations. I am Jamaican, I'm an immigrant, I am Black, I am representing a large group of people, but I don't represent each individual in that group. So I'm going to say something that you will know somebody who disagrees with me. I will say some things my mother disagrees with. But that's where conversations start, right?
Yep.
Personal perspectives. And so this basically is an invitation. I will share my perspective, and this is an invitation for us to share and participate in a conversation about how we can stand together in our stand against racism. All right, so let's start with some numbers. The Department of Homeland Security Yearbook of Immigration Statistics does not break down, we should talk about the lack of statistics here, I could not find, let me say that, maybe I just wasn't looking carefully enough, does not break down immigrants by race. So this is a total number of immigrants for the year 2016, 1,183,505. Now, this is the number from the Caribbean, and this is the number from the African continent. Let's assume that a lot of those are Black, right? That's a fair assumption. So we're talking about 180,000, almost 180,500 from the Caribbean, and then from the African continent, over 110,000. The Migration Policy Institute kind of breaks it down a little further. And again, we're talking about sub-Saharan African population. Again, we're going to assume that these are Black people, okay? So here's the discussion. These are a lot of potential allies. And we're using the word allies, and it might raise some eyebrows, because typically speaking, when we talk about allies in the discussion of race, we're talking about sympathetic whites. But why is that? Why are sympathetic whites considered allies? Why? Anybody?
Because they're the privileged group.
Yeah,
Well, because they're the privileged group. And because we don't view the fight as theirs, right? We don't view the fight as theirs. They're helping. They're allying with us in our own fight. And we assume that when Black immigrants come here, because their skin is Black, that they view the fight as theirs. And that's not necessarily true. So we're going to talk about two things. We're going to talk about why they might not see themselves as part of the group that is fighting. And then we're going to talk about then how can we bridge the gap moving forward. All right, so coming into this, I asked a whole lot of people, send out a survey by email, just like, tell me what you're thinking. I didn't want to make assumptions. I didn't want to represent every thought, or maybe something I was missing. I was not surprised, right? These are, I am not Black American.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of Black immigrants say, if there is a form that requires me to say I'm Black American, I'm going to say other. If it says Black, then I'll say Black, but I'm not American. We also grew up with a lot of, or we're also exposed to a lot of messaging that is inconsistent with the truth in this country. So when we come here, we come with some misconceptions that makes us feel other. Right, so we're gonna talk about, there's a Jamaican saying, you'll see there's a line, if any of you saw it, that I will try to say later because I'm gonna say once. I'm gonna just say once. All right, so we think differently because we're different. Historical ignorance leads to racism blind spot. Our lived experiences are different, and we're trying to be good guests. That's kind of like the overarching idea here. So let's kind of like get into that a little bit. There are some things that you may know but just never thought about in this context. For example, many Black countries were self-ruled when Black Americans were still trying to get voting rights. That affects mindsets. The civil rights era, Jim Crow laws, redlining, busing, blackface, those are all parts, well-known parts of the American lexicon. Don't find themselves in other societies. There's no relation to them. We don't know what they are. A friend of mine couldn't understand why a classmate was upset about a watermelon joke. She just didn't get it. She's like, I don't understand, why are you upset? And she goes, it's racist. And she goes, I don't get it. I don't get it. If the fullness of the Black experience is not finding its way into American textbooks or into American media, then what more so if you're from a different country? You're not getting the fullness of the Black American experience. You're not understanding context and history. It's not represented in our history books fully, is it? No. So certainly it's not getting outside the borders. I grew up with West Indian history. I didn't know anything about American history at all. And I'm not badly read, but I just didn't know about it. And there is something to be said for that cumulative knowledge that an immigrant does not have. So when my son thinks I'm being too hard on him because he did something wrong and I'm punishing him, he is upset that I'm using my cumulative knowledge. I have told you about this 100 times and you keep doing it. That's why the punishment is harsh. He wants me to think of it in isolation. And that's a difference between the way Black Americans think about their history and the way immigrants think about their history. A Black immigrant is more likely to see a racist incident as isolated, outlying, random, and not necessarily part of a systematic or systemic racist institution. That's one of the ways to look at it. And like I said, historical ignorance creates a racism blind spot. Another story I can tell you, my best friend, shortly after she arrived in South Florida from Jamaica, she was in college, and somebody asked her, one of her white classmates asked her, what boat did you come over on? And she thought they were just curious about how she got here. So she said, oh no, I didn't come on a boat, I came on an airplane. And it wasn't until she was, I was like, are you serious? Do you not understand that that was not somebody just being curious? But that is context, the lack of context for racism. Another friend, related a story about how he thinks he may have been treated unfairly at a traffic stop. but didn't really talk about it being racist. He was like, oh, you know, I shouldn't have been speeding. I shouldn't have put myself in that position. So there's a very different way of relating to these kinds of situations. The other one is lived experience. There is no racism in a Black country. Classism? Absolutely. Colorism?
Mm-hmm.
But not racism. If everybody is Black, there is no racism. What is the definition of racism that we know? What's the definition of racism that the law uses?
What is the definition of racism?
Mhm.
Is the unfair treatment of people from different races.
But it's
Well, if
about,
every-
but it's about power.
It's about power. Now, if everybody in power looks like you, if everybody in government, on TV, in your newspapers, your teachers, your co-workers, if everybody looks like you, where is the racism? One of the things you'll hear Black immigrants say all the time is, I didn't know I was Black. I didn't think of myself as Black until I got here. Until you get here. It's a completely different, even the idea of being a minority is a very different idea when you're not from the United States. So certainly that makes you relate to things very differently. The American Psychiatric Association published a paper last year based on a University of Arizona study into the physical and psychological effects of racism on Black people. Racism and racial discrimination adversely affect mental health, producing depression, anxiety, and a heightened psychological stress in those who experience it. Chronic emotional stress is known to have negative physical and mental effects. Racism and racial discrimination create a unique environment of pervasive additional stress for people of racial and ethnic minorities in the United States. These repeated traumatic interactions can result in reduced self-esteem and internalized hatred as they are forced into conservative and apologetic thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So we're talking about the difference in just the way you're living. If this has not been your reality, then you're going to address everything differently. You're facing everything differently. Our battle scars are different. So the way we respond to microaggressions, policy racism, the way we respond to rudeness or racist interactions will be different. If you even notice it. The other thing about the lived experience is when you're living in a Black country, accomplishment looks the same like you do. There is a reason why hashtag representation matters is like a thriving hashtag right now, because you are affected by what you see. You think you can accomplish what you see accomplished. So a lot of immigrants come here without any doubt that they can do whatever they want. Now that may get beat out of them at some point, but they come here with that thought. So that also makes a difference. Also, there is also the exposure to racism. As with a lot of minority communities, Black immigrants tend to settle together in high concentration, in high metropolitan areas where blatant, flagrant racism is probably less likely. So I spent most of my life in South Florida. Nary an incident. My first trip to Huntsville, Alabama, squared me right up. I understood immediately what that was about. My first trip to Huntsville. So it depends also on where you live. My brother talked to me about working in downtown Chicago, where he didn't even think about his skin color. I mean, it's downtown Chicago. But just working near to the airport, he got called the N-word. Mm-hmm. So it depends on where you are. And since most of us are living in areas, high metropolitan areas, that doesn't happen. The other thing, too, is gospel of work equals success. This is not just the black immigrants. Like all immigrants kind of have this notion that that if you just work hard, if you're not finding success, if you're complaining about the man, then you're just doing something wrong, right? If you work really hard, then you'll find success. Everybody I talked to kind of gave me some kind of version of America's a land of opportunity. All you have to do is work hard. We didn't have the luxury of growing up here. If you're not succeeding, you must not be working hard enough. There is little thought to institutional racism. And again, going back to that blind spot, that racial blind spot. So here's a quote from someone I know. We don't focus on the negative. Yes, racism is there, it's everywhere. But you are just aware of it, you move on, and you focus on what you want to achieve in life, which is going to school. Important to us who come from a third world country, where we know this is a way to a better life, versus someone who was born here, like not my little brother, her little brother, who does not value education like I do because he was given everything. He has not had to work so hard. He hasn't seen the atrocity of poverty. Those of us from elsewhere are more grateful than those born here. Most people here have never seen true poverty. Now, we can agree or disagree. My only point is to talk to you about mindset and why there may be differences in the way things are viewed, right? But here's another perspective, right? Here's somebody saying, yeah, we kind of have had this idea for a while, but now we're all in one dangerous one. Actually, wait a second, let me see. This is why I should follow notes. I'm trying to find oh, here we go. Okay. We have been divided, but now we're all in one dangerous lump. Those of us from, anybody knows where that came from? Yes. Context. Can't think we are better because doesn't have a superior culture. We have been rejected in Europe, deported and put in refugee camps, and brown people are separated and caged at borders. Yale students, business execs, children at pool parties, selling lemonade, folks on their cell phones, innocent or guilty with camera footage and without, have been completely degraded and singled out because we are black. We're all black. So, part of this, next one. So that's kind of like two people's viewpoint. But here's another thing to consider. The Migration Policy Institute used data from, actually I think I'm missing a slide. I think I might be missing a slide. Yeah, I am missing a slide, so I'm just going to talk about it. The Migration Policy Institute used data from the U.S. Census Bureau's 2015 American Community Survey and from the DHS yearbook to compile demographics on immigrants from sub-Saharan Africa, which includes Nigeria, Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, Liberia, and Somalia. And the data indicates that these immigrants have a much higher educational attainment than Americans and than other immigrants. In 2015, 39% of those aged 25 and over had a bachelor's degree, compared to 31% of the U.S. born population. That number blew me away. I don't know if you knew. It's only 31%. And 39 from sub-Saharan Africa. They also participate in labor force at a higher rate and are likely to be in management, business, science, and the arts. Why am I bringing this up? Because while these statistics are about specifically sub-Saharan African immigrants, this is the knowledge of every black immigrant home. We all think we're doing really well, and we're prospering despite. Right? We all think that, again, back to the work equals success gospel. This is evidence. This is what we're seeing in our homes. We all, have an uncle who's a lawyer and, brother who's a doctor, and we black immigrants view themselves as doing really well. I don't have statistics to prove it all, but except for this group. So let's talk about the third bullet of reasons why we think differently. Does anybody remember what that one is?
Good need.
Good guess. Thank you. All right, so who doesn't behave differently when they're in somebody else's house?
Ooh.
We're all on our best behavior when we feel like guests. And there is this notion that we are guests. Like the phrase that I'm going to say, and hopefully none of you know what a Jamaican accent is supposed to sound like, so it won't matter. But, but there's a Jamaican saying that says, some pressure. But come here for drink milk, when I come here for cow. There.
You came for milk and not to count the cow?
Exactly.
Okay.
So I don't have any skin in this game.
Mhm.
I'm here to take what I can and then go home. There was a whole generation of Jamaicans and other black immigrants who talked about, or who still talk about, going home when they retire. Right? Going home. Now, if home is somewhere else, what investment do you have in where you are? Which is completely different from a saying my father says, which is water where you are fed, right? Which is you live here and you're benefiting from it, so you should be invested here. But a lot of immigrants don't feel that way. Home is somewhere else. They send their children home to grandparents for the summer and for winter. They go home every year. Home is they're still very connected, and it's hard to be heart connected in more than one place. Another part of being a good guest is keeping your nose down and minding your business. Keep your nose down and mind your business. They live here. They're from here. They can't get deported. Nothing bad will happen to them. So you just keep your nose down. Get what you're getting and then leave. It's a path of least resistance, right? We are busy code switching. Black Americans talk about code switching. Well, black immigrants are code switching 3 different ways, because we have to relate to other black Americans, we have to relate to the white folks, and then we got to talk to each other. We're just all over the place. We're just trying to hold it together and stay in our lane. So we just try to be good guys. There's also the mantle of the good black. Right? A friend of mine and I were talking the other day and talking about something racist a coworker said, and he said, "But not you."
Oh.
Not you.
You're one of the good ones.
And that there's that idea. You're one of the good ones. And for a long time, black immigrants were one of the good ones because they didn't participate in the resistance. You minded your manners, so you're one of the good. You didn't make any trouble, and we wore that. It's kind of like going into the game, seeing who is winning, and aligning with who you think is the winner. Like, I know who signs my paychecks, and the paycheck guy don't look like me. The business owners don't look like me. So kind of like making that kind of alliance.
Asian immigrants do that too.
Oh. So, and there were a generation of black parents who encouraged their children that they brought with them and the children they had here to set themselves apart from black Americans. You want to be good, you don't want to be all mixed up in all of that. How many of you have heard about the new film, Sorry to Bother You?
Mm-hmm.
If you've heard about it?
What?
So the whole concept is, somebody who has taken the path of being white or talking white in the movie or acting white in order to find success. And it's basically, that's the Black Immigrant Manifesto. Like, how do I find success here without getting into trouble? Let's align with the winner. But that illusion is mostly out the door, which is how we get to this, which is how we get to here. Though we can't afford to set ourselves apart because we are all. My friend Monique says, if a cop pulls you over, they're not interested in knowing, that you are from a well-heeled family in the high hills of St. Andrew, Kingston. They don't care. The only thing that matters is the color of your skin. So, we're talking about, and this is where we are. According to the Pew Research Center, the share of Americans who say racism is a big problem in society increased 8% points between between 2015 and 2017. 8 points in 2 years. And if you go back to 2011, it doubled. So rather than finding ourselves in a situation where racism is getting better, how many of you remember, this is about, 2008, when we were supposedly in a post-racial society? Anybody remember that?
Yes.
Oh, we don't feel very post-racial right now. No, we don't. So there is no way to ignore this. There's no way to think this doesn't relate to you. There is no way to set yourself apart anymore. You have to see that this applies to all of us. There's a shift away from disinterest and willful ignorance among Black immigrants. For some of us, it was the shock of the racist vitriol President Barack Obama faced. A friend of mine, said she didn't understand freedom of speech. Like, I don't get it. And if you think about some African countries where that is not a reality, how can they say those things about them? Like, just, so it was that. And then for others, it was the silence of white friends in the face of unveiled bigotry during the last presidential election. No matter how disengaged some Black immigrants might have been, we are all more keenly aware of our stake in this country. Our Black sons are at stake. Access to higher education, which is of value to us, is at stake. Or peace of mind and sense of safety is also at stake. We have been tossed into the fight whether we want to be in it or not.
Are you taking questions or not yet?
Just one more slide. So, what do we do about it? How do we align? For all of us, and this is for West Indians or any Black immigrant, and for others in the stand against racism, we need to check our biases and our privileges and our prejudices. I sent out like a little questionnaire to other Black immigrants, and one of the most effective ways of reporting back to me was leaving me voice notes. And she's an old dear friend of mine, left me 16 minutes of just talking. And I played it back to her, and she goes, I don't even know where that came from. She goes, my children are Black Americans. But it was all these things about how we're different, and how our values are different, and how we don't see things the same way. And it's because we're listening to the lies. Because our values are we're listening to the lies. We have to remember that the same people who tell Black immigrants bad things about Black Americans are the same people who are calling Mexicans rapists.
Oh.
It's the same people who are showing the worst. I mean, how often do we see positive images of African countries in the media? So the bad stories are being told about all of us. And so we have to recognize that they're lies. And we have to choose to see truth. There's no difference in us. They're bad Black immigrants. They're bad Black African Americans. But most of us, it's not just a few good ones. Some of you are good, I'm sure. It was afraid of it. But most of us are good people just trying to live. And that's something that we have to see. Ask questions, get to know each other. Before we gathered here, we were just talking about, she and Taylor, we were all talking about some of the ridiculousness. I've been asked about houses and trees. We're consistently asked about how do you speak such good English.
Oh my God.
Or speaking native tongue.
It's my native tongue.
King's English,
So,
thank you very much.
Assumptions are made about how kind of education. A coworker said something about, oh, that's because you grew up poor, without knowing anything about my upbringing at all, just an assumption. And it comes from this whole thing about people coming here for a better life. But that's a catch-all. And it really doesn't indicate all the reasons people come here. People come here because they got married, they want to go to school, and then they fell in love. A lot of people leave, make social and professional sacrifices to be here. A lot of people leave very good lives to live here for all kinds of reasons. Not everybody's fleeing poverty and famine and war and political unrest. Those are not the only reasons people come to this country. We have to recognize that we're all in this together. The whole conversation about giving allies ways to talk, it applies to everyone. Understand that racism exists, and it exists in our every single day. Understand that where you are coming from might make you see it differently or not see it at all, but doesn't make it any less a reality for me or your neighbor. Just understand that that is part of the existence of living in this country. And because you came from somewhere else, or because you're from here, doesn't mean our challenges are any different.
Oh, yeah.
Now we can talk. Now we can ask questions. Karen, you had a question?
Well, I guess my question is, all of what you're saying is true, and I guess what do you think the shift is? Because, during the civil rights movement, when people were sitting in at lunch counters, there were black immigrants. And so the struggle has taken different twists and turns, but it's always been there. You can go back to lynching, you can go back to slavery. So there's been a continuous flow, right, of injustice. And there have been immigrants who've come. And I do think that they were keep a nose down, come what you're getting, whether it's education or marriage or love or whatever. I think that is true. But something changed, not just since 2008. And I was curious, what do you think that is?
What's the change you observed?
Well, I think that the difference is that the immigration policy changed. And so there's always been control on who gets in and who doesn't. And so, it started with whites on who gets in and who doesn't. And then it moved to, some blacks, whether they, trickled in from Africa or the Caribbean. And I also think that where it happened, I think New York by proximity, Florida, maybe even Texas by proximity, had more of an international flair than Iowa, than Nebraska. And equally on the West Coast, people who were of Asian descent, they were there. And so there was some understanding, and Mexican too, of sensitivity. But I think I don't even think, like I said, it was 2008. I think that it has been a slow boil from 30 years ago. Because 30 years ago, what was said is that America's going to turn more brown because there's going to be more immigration. And so all the people who everybody saw the same thing. So it's not like they turned on the light and all of a sudden everybody's just understanding it. People saw the sit-ins in the 50s. They saw Malcolm X and Martin Luther King get shot. No one is absolved. I mean, I'd be shocked if someone said, "Oh, I didn't know about that."
I think there's a difference. And then when I started, I talked about having to generalize, right? I'm giving a perspective that I'm sure doesn't represent I definitely know it doesn't represent everyone. But I think there's also the difference in people who were here during that time, and I think it's kind of like the same malaise that sometimes affects the people complain about young black people too, which is kind of like, it's not that bad right now, and the fight was already done. I think there might be some of that where if you weren't here during that time and you're not educated, like let's talk about context and blind spot, that you just don't know and you're not engaged. Those of people in here who are friends of mine will tell you I rail on my West Indian people all the time about becoming active. You have to engage, you have to understand the American political, you live here, understand how the political system works. A lot of people just don't understand and feel overwhelmed by it, or just don't think that their input is needed.
And that it applies to them.
Or that it applies. And again, we talk about, it's different now in that it's more likely to get somebody hurt.
Yeah, and I think the difference is, I talked about the control of population. So back in the 40s and 50s, the numbers from Africa, from China were small.
Mm-hmm.
So there was not the concern about browning of America. There was not that concern.
Yeah.
That's why immigrants could come if they were Irish or Asian or Chinese, because people didn't feel
Threatened.
No, they didn't.
They didn't feel threatened.
So you know, as we become more global and more connected and more traveled, I think that's what's contributed, and that's forced the issue, because people knew who was from the West Indies, and people could live in their respective communities. Princeton was like that, right? Little communities all over this country were like that. So if you had a Chinatown, you had a Pole Town, everybody lived and coexisted separately. It was the mix that caused the disturbance. That's what I think.
Well, 1965 is when the United States overhauled the immigration laws and opened up opportunities for people from countries other than in Europe to immigrate to the United States. So there was a huge sea change in who was coming over to the United States after that law passed. So 64, we have the Civil Rights Act, we have the Voting Rights Act, and then 65, we have the immigration law overhaul reform. I mean, I think everything changed at that point.
Right, that's what I'm saying. It's going back. It's not 2008. 64 would be going back, you know, over 50 years. And education changed too, and it's continuing to change. So the students who come and stay and raise families and fall in love, like you said, and mix. That was where the change. When we had our own little Italian town, everybody was like, "Cool, I'll go to your restaurant, you'll go to mine. We'll do our diversity." There was no concern. So this goes back, and people could live and coexist, understanding that we're not going to mix. That's just my personal opinion. I'd love to hear pushback.
Well, it's
I'll
not
push you
pushback.
back.
Sure,
Yeah,
sure.
go ahead.
I'm from another time. My father came here in 1927, so he immigrated from North Carolina because in 1927 because he'd seen lynchings and he was afraid of white people, really afraid of white people. If in the town that he grew up in, and I've been to it, if white people walked down the sidewalks, we stepped off, and because I was from Philadelphia, my cousin would push me off because I didn't realize that I should be jumping off really fast. So for me, this has never shifted. I have the conversation in our house growing up was the latest thing that white people had done to black people, what black people had to do. So when you said when did things change, I don't think they changed. I think they evolved.
That's what I'm saying.
I
Yeah, I
think they
agree that
evolved
river has flowed.
from slavery, from White Citizens
Absolutely.
Council. There were just different ways
To do
of oppression. For me, and then my father, by the way, was a union leader, so we talked about justice all the time. So I've just always been out there with my stick on my back. So I don't feel shifts. I just think there are changes in how people do what they do. I think a lot of contributions also have to do with the change in technology, the growth of the cities, there are other things, but racism is just clear to me as when I was 5 years old. By the time I was 7 years old, I was reciting not declaration. What is it? My country
Pledge
to
of
the
Allegiance.
Pledge of Allegiance, and for the land of the free and the home of the brave, if you're white. And I was 7 years old.
Wow.
Right, but you and I are saying the same thing.
Oh, are we?
Yes.
Okay.
The only difference is, because that was my point originally, that everybody saw Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, whether you were an immigrant or not. So it's not like that's new. That's where we're in agreement. The difference is that the immigration population, as the shift increased in this country, that's what I was responding to. The increase in immigration in this country and the tossing of the salad, that's what corporate America said. We're going to have diversity. The world is going to become more brown. They said that 25, 30 years ago, and it has proven to be true. And so education is the magnet. People come here from all over to get educated and to work. And you're right, they may not consider this home, but they may be on an extended stay. And they get married and have children and they move around and their career grows. But to me, that's what changed. That's why immigrants now have to be concerned
Absolutely.
about being black.
Absolutely.
Because the river has always flowed, just like you said. It has always flowed. The injustice has always been visible around the world. It's not been hidden. It's been very
is
obvious.
Kind of the point I was making about kind of that the illusion is gone.
Exactly.
There was that illusion that we could keep our noses down and be good guests.
Right.
And nobody would notice that we were here.
Right. So
You know,
the
it
same
wasn't
can
our
be said
vibe.
for women. Okay? Women have said, well, that doesn't apply to me, right? That doesn't apply to me. And I'm not going to change the conversation, but let me just plant this seed. When we see babies taken from mothers, white women stormed somewhere last weekend with their babies in tow and said, try it. Try it. But babies have been taken from mothers in this country. But so the allies, it's the same thing, right? We have to have allies.
We have to have allies. And like I said, and when I say we, I'm not even talking about me, quite honestly, because I've been engaged for a long time for whatever, and I don't know why, and I want to be honest about that. There are people who are my age, similar upbringing, who do not think the way I think. I want to say it's NPR. I really do.
You say it's NPR.
And I want to say that, but because I did not grow up in a home where my parents were talking about racial, it never happened. It never happened. I only recently have conversations with my mother about her political views. Very recently, it was not something that was part of my existence growing up, and it's not part of many of the my friends growing up. That wasn't part of their existence. It's new. As I have been loud and vocal in advocating for engagement, I've seen some shift in some people, but others are adamant that Black Americans are doing this all wrong. And one of the points I really want to make is that not all Black Americans are on the same page either. Because while some people were doing the sit-ins, there were folks at home going, y'all crazy, all kind of trouble.
Right.
If you just sit and be quiet,
Right.
things will fix themselves.
My mother was one in the 60s. She said, you're just stirring up trouble.
Just stirring up trouble.
So there were Black Americans who also subscribed to keep your nose down,
Yes,
do your work, be a good guest.
Exactly. And so the lack of engagement comes basically from the same seeds.
It's the same seed.
It's the same seeds. It's the same seeds. But nobody can afford to do that anymore. Nobody can afford. So then,
When
those
you
of
say
us,
nobody, do you mean absolutely nobody?
you could try if you want to. You're not going to drive. You're not going to use your phone. Not going to try to use your neighborhood pool. Not going to have a barbecue. What else can we do?
Mind your business.
You can't even mind your business. There's nothing you could do. And you talk about, there was a time when, like you said, you worried about your menfolk going for a drive.
Right.
Now you worry about yourself too. Women have to, nobody's safe. Was it Harvard or was it Yale?
Yale.
Yes.
Yale.
Yeah.
You can't even go to a fancy smancy school. You can't take a nap in the middle of your studies at your fancy school. You cannot do that. So I would say nobody. We cannot afford to. So then the conversation becomes, how do you relate to Black immigrants whose context and history is different? How do we pull them in? How do we engage them? How do we make this relevant to them other than just say, well, you can try if you want to, but you're going to be treated the same way?
Well, I think one of the things is you recognize that their experience is different. First, you have to, that piece you had up, people really have to get to know each other, and getting to know each other means what was your experience and how different was your experience. I don't think we understand people until we understand their experience.
Yes, Chief.
Yeah, coming from Trinidad, because everybody was all mixed up, nobody really looked at each other and say, hey, but there was obviously the status, right? If you had more money, could be black, white, whatever, you're on a different level, right? And I came here for college, and this was the only time I realized that racism existed. I was in my 20s, and oh my God, it's like, I thought this America was, open and everybody, was friendly and everything. And I'm like, oh my God, people actually, single you out and, stigmatize you. And, it was like, wow, okay, this is the color of my skin. I'm not as white as that person, and I'm not as dark as that person, and I'm not Asian really, but I'm Asian descent, but I'm from the Caribbean, so where am I? Right? I don't fit anywhere here, but yet you feel as though you don't, you feel the racism, sexism, everything, which was a weird feeling, And then working at the county down in Florida, I met a few Black Americans, and I'm like talking to them, whatever, we get along, we have lunch together, fine, right? And when I listen to them and they're talking about their experiences, they lived in the hood, right? And they were really happy to have a good job, and they wouldn't like do anything that would be too controversial or anything like that because they wanted this job, right? So one day I said to my friend Brenda, I'm like, hey, we're selling my mother-in-law's house in the suburbs, and I mentioned we had this patio set, and we had it out in the driveway, and if her husband wanted, he can go by, the gate's open, he can go get it,
Shaking her head. Surprise me with a good ending to the story.
So, she looked at me with her eyes this big, right? And she's like, oh, no, we won't go there, because we get basically arrested. I'm like, what? I'm like, no, I gave you permission. You can go in my house with your ticket. Right? So that is like, I'm like, oh my God, these people live a totally different life. It's not this American life that I heard about, that open society and whatever. And it was.
It's not Dallas.
Yeah. It was.
Which is what we all watch.
Yeah.
In
No, but it was.
Right? In the islands, Dallas and
it was amazing that she led a totally different American life.
Yes.
It was not the norm that I thought everybody lived. And then she would take me back in the hood and we'd buy food out of this woman's house and whatever and have, and we'd be fine, But the thing, I could go in her neighborhood, but she couldn't go in my neighborhood without me. It was the weirdest thing, right? And I'm like, oh my God.
The American Dream brochure that Black immigrants or immigrants in general get the fine print is really fine. The disclaimer is there, but you get it when you get here. Yeah, we
And
didn't
then,
really mean you.
And another thing, so I got here now. Like if I just came off the boat, right? And my friend comes up to me. She's this Black American, right? And she's like, you know what? I need to rent a car, but they won't rent it to me, right? She's like, I said, okay, don't worry about it. I'll go rent it for you, you know? So I get the car, and I rent it for her, and she and her friend took off. Next thing, I get a call from the cops saying, did you allow this person to drive this car?
Wow.
I'm like, what? You know, I'm like, it's, you know, I rented it, and she's the person that's paying for it and driving it. And they're like, oh, okay, thank you. I'm like, oh my God, it's like she could have gotten arrested. And my friend, you know, because she was Black and driving a car that they thought she couldn't afford. You know what I mean? And they saw the person that rented it was me, so they called me to find out if it was stolen. You know? Yeah, right. And I was like, oh my God, I can't believe living like that.
Well,
You know?
increasingly that kind of story is not, it's the norm. And it's the norm not so much that you read it all the time,
No.
but that it's closer, you know somebody, you've had it happen to you, it's constant. I was pulled over 2 weeks ago. It's very aggravating. There's a lane, my office driveway opens right into a lane, but people come all the way, anyway, it's aggravating. And I know exactly why the police officer stops me. I know what he thinks I did, and I know I didn't do it. And I know he can't know that I didn't do it because of where he was. So he pulls me over, and I say, yes, just like that, yes. And he goes, license and registration. I said, I'm pulling it out. I said, are you going to tell me why you pulled me over? And he goes, I just need your license and registration. And I said, I'm getting it, but we can talk while I'm getting it. Can you tell me why? And I'm, getting it. And he grabs it out of my hand and he walks away. Comes back and he said, I pulled you over because you were driving on the shoulder. And I said, no, I was not. I work at Entronics and the lane starts right in front of the driveway. And he goes, no, it doesn't. And I said, yes, it does. We could go back there with a ruler if you'd like. And he goes back, I think he went back, thought about it for a second, realized he was wrong. And he came back and he goes, I'm not going to give you a ticket because I don't deserve one. But I want to know why you have an attitude. So I said, an attitude? Did I raise my voice? No, you didn't. Did I curse? No, you didn't. But there's an attitude. I said, the minute I asked why you stopped me, is that when my attitude started? And he was like, you know what, I'm just gonna send you on your way. And I'm telling you that story because that was a story somebody else would have related to someone, and they go, oh, that's just an office, they're just doing their job, you shouldn't question them. Right. Increasingly, Black immigrants are understanding that that's always potentially a bad situation. It's potentially a dangerous situation. And Black immigrants are becoming better. We're not separated. We are not separated.
He's not going to ask you what part of Kingston are you from. I have a question back here from Anita.
It's not a question. I was just picking back off what somebody said. So how do we pull them in? And what I've found with brown immigrants is, funnily, people don't seem to get mad about racism, but when I show the relation how racism is very similar to colonization, they seem to get it. I have found that brown immigrants are the same, want to keep the nose down, come here with their engineering degrees and their medical degrees, get a good job, get a good house, settle down for a bit, and eventually retire back to the South Asian country that they came from. And they don't relate to what's going on in the country right now unless you feel for it. You just don't relate to it. You just keep your head down and go about your way. But if I start talking to them about colonization, if I start talking to them about Britishers and what happened in my country, India, they start to get mad. And then if I start to show that it's a power thing, this is how power worked back before 1947 in India, and this is how it works here, and it has been working here for many years, then they start to make the connections. Because it's always like, it's not my struggle, it's somebody else's struggle, and I'm gonna stay away from it. But if you put it in context with what has happened with your own ancestors, then okay, I kind of get it, and slowly it comes about. Because there were a lot of South Asian immigrants that voted in 45. There were a lot of South Asian immigrants. There are South Asian immigrants ready to fund the wall. And why is that? Why do you want to do this? This doesn't make sense. What is this about? Oh, it's about the visa. We won't. The H-1B people can't come in, and our kids are going back, and our kids have never been to India, and etc., etc., etc. And then you start going down to the little things. This is what it means. This is how it has been in this country. And pinging off what you said, a lot of us came here without any context to what happened in this country. I didn't know about the civil rights movement, and I'm a millennial. I grew up in the social media age. I should know about these things because it's been spoken about, but I didn't. We weren't taught the history of what happens on the other side of the planet, same as Americans living here are not taught the history about what happens in the other side of that globe. So I didn't know the history, and I honestly didn't think it was that bad. And I came here 2 years ago. There should not have been an excuse for me to think that it can't be that bad. But I really did come here thinking it wasn't that bad. And then in New York City, somebody tells me to go back to Pakistan, and I'm like, but I'm not even from Pakistan. What are you talking about? So it's what I'm getting at is that a lot of people actually do not know about the history of what has happened here, and I can see why Black immigrants might not know, because you just didn't learn about it. You think, I get this sense from Americans that whatever happened in this land, everybody knows about it, but we don't. Yeah. Just like you couldn't show me India on a map if I could, pull it out. For a lot of people that tell me to go back to my country, you wouldn't even point out where I am on the map.
India, is that South America?
A lot of people think about it that way. But those were the 2 points that I was trying to make, that I find myself trying to change the brown immigrant perspective of racism by using colonization as a metric. This is how it worked, and everybody can relate to that. Oh yeah, my ancestors owned a lot of land, and then Britishers came in, and this happened and that happened, and etc., etc. So that's how I go about it.
I think that's a very good point, in that justice is justice no matter what accent you're in. Mm-hmm. So if there is a way to talk about the the struggle and standing against racism now as just the right thing to do, because sometimes people get prickly about as I said, we don't have context, and there is a racism blind spot. You talk about what's right and how to treat people. If that's the way we to have the conversation, if that works, then it works. If we're talking about justice.
I have a question.
Yes.
I have a question. So you talked about your experience, right, in your first generation. And you have...
Actually, my mother grew up there.
Oh, okay. So you're raising a son now. And you talked about having conversations with your own mother about her political beliefs. How do you see your son growing up in today's climate and kind of navigating his own way and finding his own way in the world?
That's a very interesting question. And I'm going to start with, I don't know if you heard me talk about a friend of mine who went on and on and on, and then talked about Black Americans and how different we were, and then went, oh yeah, but my kids are Black American. But I'm going to raise them like they're not. I think that's impossible. I have 2 sons, and they are as different as night and day. And I will tell you 2 different stories about that answer your question. Again, NPR. That's all I listen to. So all I listened to before 2016. Now I have to escape. But so they are both exposed to the same kind of, and I speak out loud. And I'm not necessarily telling them what to think or what to believe, but I just talk out loud. And both of them, the first incident I will tell you about was we were listening to something about police violence, and my older son said, I don't get it. My Windsor police are really nice. And I said, okay. I quite honestly didn't know how to react to that. It took me like a little while, like I think later in the day, and I said, I want you to understand that while we assume that most police officers are good and nice and decent and just doing their job, is that you have to understand that because of the color of your skin, you may very well be treated differently. I don't know, we talk about the hand on the, the steering wheel, have your hand in plain view. He rolls his eyes. My 14-year-old gets it.
Wow.
Completely gets it. Rails against the man all the time. Another conversation when, during the election campaign, Hillary had said all lives matter and was being dragged for it. Again, my older one was like, I don't get it. All lives do matter. Yeah. And my younger son was like, are you crazy? Yes, all lives matter, but we're talking about in the context of Black lives not mattering and being devalued. He was able to break it down and explain it to his older brother. Now, why the two of them are not getting it, I don't know. All I can do is keep saying the same things over and over and keep talking to them. Again, which is the odd thing. My older one if you ask him about his heritage, he's like, I'm Jamaican. He loves Jamaican food. And the other one, like, that's not for me. I'm Black American. Wow. So it's very different. The conversations that we have are about the way they move in the world, and respecting themselves and demanding respect from other people, and we don't always agree on how that comes. He also tells me I worry too much about race. You worry too much about race. And if you let other people dictate, he gets an assignment and he can choose any genre to deliver information in, and he chooses rap, and I go, no, don't do rap. Please don't do rap. And he goes, well, you're letting other people dictate how you behave, and then they win. And, all right. He wants to lock his hair, and I'm like, I don't know. I don't want there to be one more thing. And he's like, yeah, but you can't keep, you can't keep giving in. So it's an ongoing conversation. I'm not trying to bring them up as third generation, or I'm not trying to bring them up as anything other than two Black boys who are growing up in America.
I have another question. Because you're second generation, and I am too, I often find myself feeling so strongly about the struggles that my parents went through, emigrating from the Philippines in the 80s. And I find myself, and now I'm getting emotional right now, but I find myself getting extremely defensive when I have to think about what they went through. Does that echo with you? Was that your experience as well?
Not so much. So I remember as a child, I thought my dad had a chip on his shoulder. It was like, why are you so, and he had all these things about white people. And I remember we had gone to Disney World. We're in Orlando. We went to Disney World. And we were at an IHOP, and the waitress, in my view, was just a bad waitress. Again, talking about that whole thing about not seeing it, if you have no context. I just thought she was a bad waitress. And he was furious. Yeah. He was furious. She had thrown the cocoa thing down, and it was messy. And he insisted that she was being racist and made a scene until the manager sent her out. And I was embarrassed. I was so embarrassed. And it was later understanding stories about his life and how badly he was treated. I mean, there's nothing like calling a Black man a boy. You get all kinds of chips with that. So it took me a little while. Again, my mother grew up in New York, and I've never heard one story. As a matter of fact, she was on that list of people I sent asking for stories, and she was like, I don't have any stories for you. She's like, I was fine.
But did she grow up in an enclave of other immigrants?
So my mom life still is a circle around church, and she went to a West Indian church in New
that's
York,
what I'm saying.
and she had 8 brothers. So like it's
Right.
and they hung around with West Indians. And
Right, that's
so
what I'm
she
saying.
might have been insulated.
Right, she was insulated. That's my point. That when you have Chinatown, Pole Town, Filipino town, Italian town, it is easy to live culturally, right? Eat your foods. It's the mixing. It's stepping outside of those towns and living with others that it becomes uncomfortable.
And I think to that point, what happens when you stay in your circles and you live in your circles, you don't have an expectation of these people accepting you because you're like, I'm going right back to where I'm supposed to be. So whatever they do is like, well, yeah, that's what they do. It's okay. Like, so yeah, we're not mixing. We're coexisting, but not commingling.
Exactly.
Right?
And the comfortability is on both sides.
Yes.
It's on the sides of the immigrants,
Yes.
we're all comfortable with one another, and it's also on the sides of the mainstream population because we don't really have to deal with them if we don't want to.
Other than maybe at work, right? Then you do it at work, but then you come home and it's like, I don't know what you do in your house, but we get in our comfortable clothes. We take off that corporate stuff.
Yep.
Put on our jammies.
Yeah.
Yep.
I am an immigrant, so I keep my nose down. So actually, I don't know. I have a couple comments. I don't know how to feel right now. I feel better or even worse. I think even worse. So I am a first-generation immigrant, and let me tell you, it's very hard to be an immigrant here and try to live your life. Of course, without knowing the American history, American culture. Yes, I am a highly skilled immigrant in this country who tried to settle down. But now I heard your story, I'm like, oh my gosh, it's even worse to be a black immigrant. So yes, but I think, and I really believe, it all starts with education. It all starts with educating our children, and in schools and in universities, and people like us, educate others and be alive and stand up for others who are different than us. Because nothing to be wrong, be different, it's just different, but we all came here to live a better life. So again, thank you so much for bringing this up, because how interesting it would be to see how other immigrants settle down. It can be another conversation, how Asian, Muslims, Jews, whoever settle down in this country, because we all have our own struggle, and I'm really sorry to hear that you have this racism, you need to facing plus with this racism. I know as an immigrant, I'm facing with a lot of discrimination. I can't even, tell you all of it. But again, so I believe as a mom of 3, we all start with educate our children and hoping that, the next generation will be more understanding, more open-minded, and things, hopefully it won't exist like this hard than it exists nowadays, and I really do everything what I able to do to solve this problem, and don't raise my children as racist. Of course, my children, they are not. But yeah, so thank you again, and I really would love to hear, immigrant from other perspective. And again, if it's harder for you than for me, I'm really sorry.
I don't think it's harder necessarily for.
But it's an additional thing.
I mean, like we were talking earlier about. Someone asked me a question about another coworker. He said, how does so-and-so identify? Does he identify as Hispanic or does he identify as white? And I was like, I don't know. It's like interesting. Like, I don't have that choice. I don't have that choice. I am black, which is kind of like the whole black immigrant thing, is like we don't, whether we had racism where we came from, whether we didn't have discrimination, we lived good lives, no matter what our situation was, we can't peel it off and leave it at the airport. We are now part of this community, and we have to figure out how to be allies, how to advocate for and understand that, if I'm from a third world country and education is important to me, it's also important to native-born Black Americans, and we have to work together.
Now, how do you
Wait,
reconcile?
we had a question over here before we.
Oh, well, I want to say I'm an immigrant, and clearly I came over as a child because I don't speak with an accent, and other people who do have accents came over when they were older. But I know for me that when I came over, I did not have any of these preconceived notions about stereotypes about races in the United States. So I had to learn them, and I was taught them very, clearly and implied and as well as direct. I was taught these things by the people around me. I saw them in movies, in TV shows, in magazines. The message was just constantly all around me, and I learned very well. Oh yes, the Puerto Ricans, well, they're ignorant and loud people, but they're a little bit better than the Dominicans, but not as bad as the Black. But so there's a whole hierarchy of race in the United States, and you are taught this. You are taught this, whether you realize it or not. The moment you come to the United States, you're taught this. So when, for example, people from Korea emigrated to the United States, and they were given opportunities in poor neighborhoods to open up small businesses like grocery stores. They were explicitly told, you gotta watch out for those Black people because they're gonna try to steal from you. They're gonna try to scam you. So we're taught this racism. It's not something that's just lying out there in the ether. It's there. Somebody tells you a dumb Polak joke. You're being taught about the hierarchy of, okay, white, near white, almost white, white ethnic. It goes down the line. And we're really taught this explicitly. And one of the things I also want to say is that I know a lot of Asian people who really who try very hard not to understand sort of the Black experience in the United States, and they try to align themselves with the white majority. And I understand why you want to do that, but I just want to say, as somebody who's worked in racial justice for decades, that model minority stereotype is not a pro-Asian stereotype. It's an anti-Black stereotype where you say, why can't you people be more like those people? Because they're the good minority. And that is total and complete BS. Because what that does, it allows sort of white supremacy to stay white supremacy because you're dividing.
It pits us against each other.
Yes, it's pitting people against each other. You people and those people, and that's all very divisive. But I'm telling you that we get these messages. When you come to this country, you're taught this. You're taught this explicitly, implicitly, in everything that you do. Everything.
I will take that further. I think some of us get the messaging before we get here.
Yes.
And there's that messaging about the bad Black, that when you get it, if you're from a predominantly Black country, you learn to separate yourself because those people are really bad, but we clearly are different. And you come here with that separation. Like, we're not like that.
The cops don't share. They don't see it.
They don't see it. They don't care. They don't see. Yes.
So I take exception a little bit to some of the discussion that's been going on with the enclaves, which is coming from my experience from living in Bermuda. When we've come back to the United States, we find it very odd that, there's a section where there's the Black people, the Hispanic people, the brown people. We're like, Bermuda is only 21 square miles, so it is crammed packed. So we have there are slight enclaves, but we're much more integrated together in our neighborhoods, and therefore our cultural and social awareness of other cultures, I think, is so much greater. And it seems like people don't know about other cultures here, and they're so geographically challenged about where things are. I mean, even the State Department can't find Bermuda on the map. They send our stuff down to Panama or down to the Caribbean, which we're 1,000 miles away from. So we find it very strange, and I think it's because one of the things I've noticed about American society is that one of the things that seem to be valued, especially by white Americans, is your privacy and your space. And so you do not want people trespassing into your space, where like Bermudians are very social and they love being able to talk. And I don't know if that's anybody else's experience, but they're very much that interactive. They really don't care about work. And I thought it's really interesting because one of the things, when two Americans get together, almost always they will ask each other, what do you do for work? When two Bermudians get together, it is who are your people. They want to know who your people are. And you can go through different cultures and say, well, if two people from your culture got together, what would they want to discuss? And so I did notice that starting that we did tend to share what we did for work. And I said, well, I must be back in the United States. But it's a strange feeling to be in isolated neighborhoods. It's just a very strange way for me coming back to the United States to live. And I think that's where we get we're not really aware of other cultures. We don't go. We know food. Food seems to be the universal. Food seems to be a universal kind of thing. But as far as other kinds of, no, white Americans, you're black. That's it. There's no other. And I keep saying to my white friends, I'm like, black culture is like white culture. There's lots of different places that you can come from and have a very, very different experience, even though your skin may all be brown. Just like we're white, we have lots of different experiences. One more thing I want to share from Bermuda is that one of the things that happened in Bermuda, it's still a protectorate of the British government, so it was heavy colonialism in there. But slavery was given up in the 1700s. It was long before it happened in the United States. So one of the things they did was they brought white people who from the Portuguese from the Azores into Bermuda to do landscaping and that kind of work. So one of the ways that they divide race in Bermuda is you can be white, black, or Portuguese. So it was, that mixing of nationalities and race and not having any understanding. So, that immigrant experience, they were immigrants. They did not qualify as white, even though their skin looked exactly like mine. So it's a different, it's really, we're struggling, my husband and I, so much right now trying to figure out, because we're an interracial couple. So we go between, Trenton and Ewing and Princeton, and it's kind of like the schizophrenia. I don't see how the two things, there's no integration. And then I guess that comes from back in colonial times where every little municipality, there's no overall, in New Jersey, your townships and your towns make all the rules. You have a very weak assembly and a strong, it's local. There you go. I'm learning. I didn't just growing up here. You don't know those kind of things. So Princeton, who can afford to live here? The taxes are incredible, and so that's that institutionalized racism that comes in and flavors that isolation that we see in the United States. I think to our detriment.
I wanted to ask, do you have kids?
Who, me?
No.
Oh, me?
Yes.
Do dogs count?
How are you raising your dog?
My
Only
husband,
in America.
my husband and I, we don't have kids, but my brother and sister are raising their own kids, and they're young kids, right? They're toddlers. And, as their auntie, I don't have a direct role in parenting them, but I try, when I see them or when I come into contact with them, I try to impart the legacy of our family, us being American, but being Filipino Americans, and for them to honor the family that came before us, because most of our family is in the Philippines.
Right.
Do
your parents say home? Do your parents refer to?
Yeah, so they talk about retiring. We'll spend a couple months in the Philippines. We'll have a home here, a home there, but they still think of it as that's home to them. And it's home to me, and I visited a handful of times, but it's home to me because that's where my family is, right?
Yeah.
Somebody else? Yes.
Oh, yes. I was going to say, though, because we were on the topic of getting allies, do you think people that have privilege, though, are going to be willing to give that up in order to be allies? And I'm not just talking about blacks. I'm talking about Africans. I'm talking about Asians and people from the Caribbean, because white Americans of certain privileges are good at separating. And as you said, saying, you know what, you're not like them. You're different. And it's hard for people to give up privilege.
I don't think it's privilege at all. And I like I said, I think it's an illusion. And I think it's an illusion that it's pretty much disintegrated at this point. I don't know anybody. I'm sorry?
Yeah, I think Barbara was saying that. I don't think privilege is an illusion. I think white people have privilege.
I'm just talking about the black immigrant.
Well,
She was
Barbara,
talking
don't you think
about
they have some privilege too?
Excuse me?
I think black immigrants, some of them have privilege too.
All of us, there are ways that you could have privilege, but I'm talking about systemic racism and institutionalized racism.
Yeah, we don't have any.
Who the judges are, who makes up the Congress, and all that. That's, for me, white privilege, and they really absolutely believe that it's their right to have that, and that's what all this chaos is holding on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand what you're asking,
Yeah.
though, about the groups of black immigrants who have been the good ones, quote unquote, the good ones.
Well, they've told them they're the good ones.
They've told them they're the good ones.
Or they believe it.
That's the illusion I think has disintegrated.
You're sure? You think so?
Who are the black? Is it just me? Black immigrants here? Well, she's Canadian, so that's
so what is that?
So I will say, here's why. You were talking about living in the United States, and I was thinking she hasn't lived here long enough. But go ahead. Maybe.
So one thing I wanted to touch on your point about racism and amongst minorities. So I I lived in Markham, which is a suburb of Toronto. High South Asian and Asian population, probably about 50 to 60%, and then maybe 30% white, and then 10% black and whatever else. And one of the most hurtful things was experiencing racism from another minority. That was one of the most hurtful things for and that may be my own my conditioning that I expected from a white person. Right? Mm-hmm. Like that's where I'm sort of like, well, yeah, you kind of know that's going to happen. But to have, when you go into a Chinese store and say, and they're, racist against you, or you go into, a Greek restaurant and they're like, that is sort of like, wow, like you have struggled as well.
Yep.
Right? But because the skin color, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But okay, so this is Lisa Lasley, and Lisa is of Jamaican parentage, but she's from Canada. Do you find that the Canadian experience with the black immigrant is different from it is in the United States?
So I have experienced the You Are Different, and I remember being in Jamaica at a resort, and I met a white American man. He was on vacation, and he said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "I'm from Toronto." He's like, yeah, I could see it. You're different." Like it came out of his mouth. So I've had that. I will say that, for me, being here the last 5 years has really opened my eyes to.
Yeah, this is not a good
Should have came earlier. Right now, it's racial.
But in Toronto, you grow up knowing that everybody's parents is from someplace else.
Right. Exactly.
Right. So I remember going to people's houses and their parents didn't speak English. They were German, Italian, Peruvian. Like that was expected. All of my friends were first generation practically. There was a huge immigration movement in the 60s and 70s where a lot of our parents. I remember my mother telling me, when her and my dad were looking for apartments. They'd call and people say, yeah, the apartment's free, the apartment's available. When they'd go, they'd say, oh, no, it's not available anymore. And after a couple of times, I said, what's going on? How come every time we call these people, they say it's available, when we show up, they tell us it's not? They didn't understand it. They're Jamaican, and in their country, they didn't experience that sort of racism, right? Everybody was black, right? Right? And it was mostly classism that they expect, right? If you had money or you didn't have money, that was it. And so it took them a couple of times to say, wait a second, let's see what's going on. So they tested the theory, and they called, the people said the apartment was available. They went, they said no, it wasn't. They went back and called back again, and people said, oh yeah, it's available, come over.
Oh my God.
So that's when they realized, they don't want to rent it to black people. But I think in Toronto, what was happening at that point in time, it was all the black people there were West Indian, right? And it was a very small community, so they were all very much sort of embracing each other, whether you're from Trinidad or wherever. So there was definitely more of a collective that they kind of pulled together that way. There wasn't that difference because everybody had left their homes to come to Canada. I was going to ask you a question about how do you rationalize the fact that I think for black immigrants or immigrants in general, when they come here, they leave so much of them behind. Right. That in itself just spurs this sort of, I need to keep my head down and really work hard because a lot of people have probably suffered or sacrificed for me to be here.
Yeah.
And then also, I think a lot of black immigrants look at black Americans and say, you were born here, you didn't have to leave anything behind, right? So it's almost like you're already 10 steps ahead of us. And I think that also plays a part in us differentiating ourselves, saying you already had an advantage because you're already here. You didn't have to leave your family.
Which is kind of like the way we think of things sometimes sets us up to be judgmental of black Americans. It sets us up for the division because it says, you're born here and you didn't do the school and you didn't, you're not doing X, Y, or Z, and we came and we did it. Why can't you do it? It's kind of like, I'm sorry. It's kind of like that setup. But
African Americans didn't immigrate. They weren't immigrants. They were kidnapped and brought over,
and dragged over,
treated as property, as chattel, for a long time before that system ended. And it ended earlier in Canada than it ended in the United States. But Canada has very similar racial attitudes towards the United States. I think that's what you meant by Canada doesn't count, because I know that most people don't know this, but Canada also interned its Canadian Japanese during World War II on the West Coast.
So the racism in Canada is really with the First Nations. So
Yeah.
if you want to create a a comparison to sort of like what's happening here with black Americans, it would be First Nations. It's very disgraceful what has happened in Canada towards the First Nations. So everywhere, every country, no one is innocent, right?
Exactly.
Like there are things that have happened everywhere, and I think where we need to go beyond is to the point where we connect because we have all suffered through something. Whether it's if it's sexism, if you're Indian, if you're black, whatever. But every culture, every race, every religion has had something. So instead of using those things to separate us, we need to use them to bind us.
Okay, one more, and then we're gonna have to
one at a time.
wrap up.
Two things. One is that the connection should be our humanity, our common humanity. It should not be that we call ourselves allies, but that we call ourselves human beings. And the other thing is, because of the times we're in now and what's going on about immigrants, people forget that we're a nation of immigrants. They somehow forget that everybody they know came from someplace else except a native born. And it's really interesting when they tell people to go back to where they were, because they could go back a couple of generations too. And I'm finished with this. I promise I have to save me.
So it's 10 minutes, and what we're going to do in the final 10 minutes is we're going to let everybody have a little chance to say a piece. Just 30 seconds, what you learned tonight. You might just want to